Hello, and welcome back to part 2 of the series on the CPT Phoenix Junior word processor that I'm repairing for a friend. Now, if you haven't seen the last video, you should probably check that one out, even if it isn't that well made, because it's a pretty good high-level overview of the machine. Today, I'll start off with an overview of what I understand about the architecture of the Phoenix Junior, and then we'll get into the diagnosis of the hardware problem by using my HP 16500B logic analyzer. Now, the architecture of this thing isn't really like anything I've ever seen before. This chip here is a Z80 CPU, which is a very popular CPU at the time. It's an 8-bit processor with a 16-bit address space, giving us up to 64K of memory. It was used in everything, from the Tandy TRS-80 line of computers, the ColecoVision, the Pac-Man arcade cabinet, and many, many more devices. Even this calculator, which you can still buy brand new, uses a variant of this processor. It was also the processor that CP/M was designed for. That means theoretically, I could port CP/M to this machine, but that'd be a miracle given my assembly skills. Turning our attention to this section of the motherboard, we see what appears to be lots of identical chips. These are MT4264 chips, which are 64K of RAM chips. But they only store 1 bit each. That's why there's 8 of them in a row, 1 for each bit. Unfortunately, these are known for going bad over time, so I suspect that the issue with this machine is with one of these chips. Hopefully, I can use the logic analyzer to verify this hypothesis, but we'll have to see how that goes in this video. The chip here is a Texas Instruments TMS 4500A, which converts the 16 address lines coming from the main bus into the row and column addresses that the RAM needs. It also supports up to 256K of memory, which I'm now certain is banked in and out of the CPU's address space as needed. The only other chip down here is a DMA controller, which could potentially be used to transfer data between the serial port, disk drive, display controller, and every other thing that shows up in the memory map. In the first part of the series, we saw that the I/O present on the back of the machine was, in my opinion, pretty well filled out. There's a COM port connected internally to this 8251A USART, or Universal Synchronous Asynchronous Receiver Transmitter, as well as an expansion header for an optional second COM port. There's also this TR1863 UART chip, which seems to be a weird kind of UART chip. It has separate pins for the transmit and receive data, so it could be used by a different part of the board, maybe not even the CPU. It's right next to this port labeled printer, and again there's an internal header for an optional second printer port, but I'm unsure of the pinout of this. It's possible that the 8251 is used to interface with the keyboard, and the TR1863 is used for the COM port as well. Again, really not that sure. Over here is a WD2793A floppy disk controller, which makes sense because it's next to the floppy drives. Now, I would talk about the video system of this, but it's entirely custom, undocumented chips, so I can't really comment on it yet. With the architecture out of the way, let's get into the debugging. Now, I've gone ahead and hooked up the CRT and the power supply to the unit, and I've already turned it on so we can see the error that it's printing. As you can see, it's printing this repeating pattern of 21240080 on the screen. Now, my theory as to what this error means is that it's doing some sort of memory test on boot, and it's failing when it gets to address 2124. What the 92 means and the 00 and 80 means, I'm not entirely sure, but hopefully it'll become evident over the course of this video. In order to see what's going on with address 2124, I'm going to be using my HP 16500B logic analyzer. Now, this thing is very useless for modern systems, but for this kind of old school, massive parallel bus, it's perfect. I'll go ahead and get everything hooked up, and then I'll bring you back to discuss the diagnosis procedure. Sorry for the noise, this logic analyzer is pretty loud. Now, with everything all hooked up, let's get into how I'm approaching debugging the system. Assuming there is a chip failing that memory self-test, I should be able to see the processor write a value to that address, and then when it tries to read from it, it should get back a value that's different from what it stored there. I've got the analyzer all set up with the Z80 inverse assembler, which will show me the instructions the processor is executing and when it's executing them. And I've set it to trigger on hexadecimal address 2124. Let's start the capture, turn the machine on, and see what happens. Alrighty, and at this point we are officially off script, so I'm going to go ahead and set the trigger here to trigger on the address bus being at 2124. Forward. We're going to go ahead and hit the listing, and I'm going to hit run. And I'm going to turn the machine on. Well, it's not seeing it, so I'm going to go ahead and... Oh, nope, it just saw it. Let's take a look. Let me analyze this a little bit, and I'll get back to you. Okay, I had to tweak my setup a little bit, but this is super promising. Looking at this here, I can see that at this location, we're reading from address 2123 and writing to 2124, and we're writing a 00. Then, as we continue on, the next instruction reads from 2124 and writes to 2125, but it reads an 80, which isn't what we put there. So that to me indicates that whatever chip drives that bit is bad, and I think that's the high bit. So now what I have to do is use this analyzer to track down what chip that is. Alright, I think I've cracked it. If you look here, you can see it's writing to address 2124, that 00 I mentioned, and then down here, it's reading from address 2124. Let me punch that up. And it's reading that 80. And down here, we've got the RAS line and the CAS line of a specific DRAM chip. Now when these both go high at the same time, that means that the chip was selected and it's outputting its memory contents. So, I've tracked down which chip it is that's causing the problem. And it's this chip right here. This is the chip that when I probed it, I saw those two RAS and CAS lines. And I also took one of these probes and put it on the data output, and it's the only one out of these chips that stays high. So, I mean, it's that chip. We found the chip. Now all we have to do is order a new one and desolder it and install the new one in a socket preferably. And that about does it for this video. Now that I know which RAM chip is bad, I can hopefully get some new ones ordered and get it replaced. Thanks for tuning in. Can't wait to see you guys next time.